الحمد لله رب العالمين وبه نستعين ونصلي ونسلم على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما يا رب العالمين. نعم.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. يسألونك عن الساعة أيان مرساها فيم أنت من ذكراها إلى ربك منتهاها إنما أنت منذر من يخشاها كأنهم يوم يرونها لم يلبثوا إلا عشية أو ضحاها. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيد الأنبياء والمرسلين وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين، أما بعد. اللهم اغفر لنا ولوالدينا ولمشايخنا ولجميع المؤمنين والحاضرين. فبأسانيدكم حفظكم الله تعالى إلى الإمام الترمذي رحمه الله تعالى قال: حدثنا محمد بن بشار يعني العبدي قال حدثنا محمد بن جعفر قال حدثنا شعبة عن أبي إسحاق قال سمعت البراء بن عازب يقول: كان رسول الله صلى الله عليه وآله وسلم رجلا مربوعا بعيد ما بين المنكبين عظيم الجمة إلى شحمة أذنيه عليه حلة حمراء ما رأيت شيئا قط أحسن منه.
نعم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Moving on with the next narration in the book, he says: حدثنا محمد بن بشار يعنى العبدي. Muhammad ibn Bashar, who is known as Abdi, he informed us. قال حدثنا محمد بن جعفر. He said Muhammad ibn Ja'far informed me or us. قال حدثنا شعبة, who said Shu'bah informed us. عن أبي إسحاق, from Abu Ishaq, who said سمعت البراء بن عازب رضي الله تعالى عنه يقول: كان رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم رجلا مربوعا بعيد ما بين المنكبين عظيم الجمة إلى شحمة أذنيه. نعم, يسرى should not be over here. عليه حلة حمراء ما رأيت شيئا قط أحسن منه. He says the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam, we have the translation. The Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam was neither, نعم, the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam رجلا مربوعا, he was of medium height, بعيد ما بين المنكبين, he had a distance between his two shoulders. The distance between his two shoulders was a lot or quite a bit. عظيم الجمة إلى شحمة أذنيه, he had long hair that continued till his earlobes. شحمة أذنيه meaning the two ears, the earlobes of the two ears. عليه حلة حمراء, upon him was a red garment. ما رأيت شيئا قط أحسن منه, I had never seen anything, or I've never seen anything which is more beautiful than the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wa alihi wasallam. نعم. So number one, in this hadith, we first start off by looking at the chain. Imam Tirmidhi rahimahullah ta'ala, he says over here, حدثنا Muhammad ibn Bashar. That Muhammad ibn Bashar, he informed us. Muhammad ibn Bashar, he is Muhammad ibn Bashar ibn Uthman ibn Dawood ibn Kaysan. And he's a great scholar and a rawi, a narrator of hadith. And we say Rawalahu al-Jama'a, meaning all of the 6 books, all of the 6 works, Bukhari, Muslim, Abu Dawood, At-Tirmidhi, Ibn Majah, and An-Nasai, all of them have transmitted from him. And he's known as Bundar. He is known as Bundar. Why Bundar? They used to say كان بندار الحديث في عصره ببلده. Bundar means حافظ, and he was the حافظ of a hadith in his time, in his city. Meaning Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala granted him a great degree of حفظ الحديث. He had memorized a lot of narrations. And interestingly, normally when you have a narrator that memorizes a lot of narrations and he's known as a hafiz, usually you find in their tarjama, in their biography, that they traveled. Because in order to gather all of these narrations, you would have traveled to the different lands, different places in the Islamic empire. But this individual, Bundar, he gathered the hadith of Basra, and initially in the beginning of his talab al-ilm, he didn't travel. Birran bi ummihi, in obedience to his mother. And his mother did not want him to travel, and so in the beginning of his journey, he did not travel, rahimahullah ta'ala. And afterwards, when he was able to travel, he traveled. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala blessed him, and maybe through this action, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accepted from him. And this is a really interesting point that we keep in mind as students of knowledge. Sometimes there are things that might seemingly, apparently seem to be preventing you from talabul ilm. At times, the situation becomes difficult. At times, the situation is such that, maybe possibly, for example, your family members are not assisting you, the people around you are not willing to be there for you, and so on and so forth. Sometimes you need to be patient in certain regards. But if you are patient for the right reasons, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala one day will open doors for you. And every single student of knowledge, he will be tested to a degree in talabul ilm. To a degree, he will be tested. As for him to study without any, for example, difficulty that he has to go through, this is not possible. Every single student of knowledge has to be tested to a certain degree. And the more deeper you go into knowledge, the more you will be tested. Because when you attain knowledge, you'll be granted great, great ranks and great heights and lofty, lofty positions. And great ranks not only in this world, but in the eyes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وَسِلْعَةُ اللَّهِ غَالِيَةٌ. The merchandise that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is willing to give is very expensive. It's not something which is easy. And the closer you get to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that's why the Messenger says in a hadith, sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, إِنَّ اللَّهَ تَعَالَى إِذَا أَحَبَّ قَوْمًا ابْتَلَاهُمْ فَمَنْ رَضِيَ فَلَهُ الرِّضَى وَمَنْ سَخِطَ فَلَهُ السُّخْطُ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when He loves a group of individuals, when He loves a group of people, when He loves some people, He will test them. A sign of the love of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He tests His slaves. Likewise, a student of knowledge, sometimes he goes through difficulty in his talabul ilm. Yes, that student of knowledge who is granted assistance from his family, the people around him are supportive of his talabul ilm, that is a great, great blessing for him. A great, great blessing for him. طيب. Regarding Muhammad ibn Bashar, Abdullah bin Ja'far bin Khaqan al-Marwazi, he says, I heard Bundar say, أردت الخروج يعني الرحلة فمنعتني أمي فأطعتها فبورك لي فيه. I wanted to go and travel, just like all of the students of Hadith would travel. And they would go to different lands in order to seek narrations. He says, فمنعتني أمي. My mother prevented me. And I obeyed what she said. I obeyed her. فبورك لي فيه. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala granted me barakah in talab al-ilm. Meaning because of my obedience to my mother, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala opened the doors for me. And sometimes barakah is something very interesting. It's a very interesting term. Barakah is when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grants you more, even though apparently what you have seems less. And it's not something which you can sometimes assess and quantify with literal value. So if you think about it, if you're looking at the numbers don't add up. But yet there is something within it that is granting it an increase. It seems as if it's replacing something far more. That is the essence of barakah. Barakah is not that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grants you $1 million. Barakah is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't grant you that much. He grants you less. But that less is enough to suffice for you, even though normally the numbers don't add up. That is the reality of barakah. And that's how dots are connected. Sometimes the dots are connected in ways that we're not aware of. Normally you would think, for example, that, subhanAllah, talabul ilm. You think, for example, what will cause you to be able to attain knowledge? So, for example, you'll say that someone who has a good memory, strong memory, a sharp mind, and he's blessed with good teachers, and that will be in a way or grant him such that he will be able to attain knowledge through these means. Because these are the asbab zahira. These are the apparent means that would result in knowledge. And someone who has time, and he's been supported by his family. Yes, these are apparent means. But at the same time, we say that sometimes there are hidden means that a person is not aware of. So these individuals, they will be able to attain, for example, in 2 years or 3 years or 4 years worth of knowledge that others might, for example, it might take them 40 years. When we look at the ulama of the past, some of them you find them, for example, An-Nawawi rahimahullah ta'ala, he passed away in his 40s. Abdul Hayy al-Laknawi rahimahullah ta'ala, he passed away in his 40s. And many great scholars, they passed away when they were young. Sibawayh passed away when he was very young. And yet they left such great knowledge behind that people are benefiting from them. Why? Because there is a hidden hand over there that is assisting and benefiting, which is the idea of barakah. So barakah is not something that you can quantify. You can't put a number to it. But yet it's there. And it's playing in the background. It's playing and influencing in the background. So he says, فَبُورِكَ لِي فِيهِ. Because at the end of the day, ilm, what is ilm? It's fahm. It's understanding. And who is the one who will grant you that fahm and understanding? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one who grants that understanding. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one that grants that fahm. So now, for example, there's individuals that are trying to understand, but it doesn't sink in. They're not able to comprehend or understand the concept that is being portrayed, even though they're making effort. And you'll experience this, for example, sometimes students are trying to memorize, and they try a lot, but for some reason they're not able to memorize. They keep exerting effort upon effort, but they're not able to. It doesn't sit in their minds. Go give sadaqah. Go be nice to your parents. Go do a little bit of khidmah, service for your teachers. And you will see that ilm by itself will come into your heart. And it's funny, you wouldn't think that serving your teacher or serving your parents or being nice to the people around you or giving sadaqah will assist in your journey of talab al-ilm, but it does assist, 100%. Because the dots are not connected the way you think they're connected. It's not necessary that you have to spend all that time to gain that ilm. Sometimes you do something else, and yet Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will grant you the barakah of that somewhere else. And you wouldn't expect it. You wouldn't even notice that the reason, and not only for talab al-ilm, this is in general in life. The dots are connected in ways that you sometimes are not aware of. That you're sometimes not aware of. For example, you go give sadaqah, and because of that, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala cures one of your relatives. One time, this is a really interesting incident that happened in the time of the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam. There were two brothers. One of them, he used to come to the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam all the time, and he used to study and spend time with the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam and learn from him and learn regarding the deen. And the other brother, he would go and work. And so basically the second brother was taking care of his first brother. But eventually, sometimes a person, he gets fed up. He's like, I'm the one doing all of the work, and this person is just going and enjoying the time spending with the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam and learning in the process. But one time he came to the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam and he said, Ya Rasulullah, this individual, meaning my brother, he doesn't do any work. And I'm the one who has to spend on him. And all he does is come and he sits in your gatherings and enjoys your words and so on and so forth. He's spending his time studying. The Messenger replied sallallahu alaihi wasallam with a beautiful statement. He said, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he said, it's possible you are granted barakah in your wealth because of this individual. It's possible you are granted barakah in your wealth because of your brother. And the time he is spending in the masajid, and the time he is spending in talab al-ilm. And you wouldn't think so. You wouldn't think that barakah is coming in your wealth because of someone else, or because of you assisting someone else. And that's why one of the greatest sadaqat that a person can give, one of the greatest forms of charity, is to spend upon students of knowledge. Spend upon students of knowledge. Why? Because a student of knowledge, when he studies, eventually he will become a scholar. And when he becomes a scholar, how many people benefit from him? If you think about what is, like, even in normal investment, you would invest in a place where your wealth would remain for the longest time. You invest in a place where you're thinking that you're going to get long-term return, and it's going to remain. It's going to be steady, not something which is, flimsy or you're not sure of it. When you invest in a student of knowledge, what happens? That individual can go and potentially, possibly, that individual, if Allah grants him barakah, he might be the means of guiding hundreds and thousands, if not millions, through that one individual. And all of that will come into your righteous deeds, your book of righteous deeds, even though you did not spend one moment. Because a talibul ilm and ulama in general, that's why Imam Abdullah ibn Mubarak, rahimahullah ta'ala, and I would advise everyone to study and read and research the biography of this individual. He passed away in the year 181. He is one of the greatest ulama of the 2nd century. In fact, of all, in the entire history of Islam. They used to say regarding him, rahimahullah ta'ala, that, again, he passed away in the year 181, meaning almost 200 years after the Messenger passed away, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Not 200 exactly, 170 years after the Messenger passed away, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So he didn't live in the time of the Messenger or in the time of the Sahaba. radiyallahu ta'ala anhum ajma'in. But they would say regarding him that he was such a righteous individual, such an amazing person, that we could not recognize between him and the Sahaba any difference in terms of his actions and his demeanor and what he would do, except for the fact that they were Sahaba and he wasn't a Sahabi. That's it. As-suhbah faqat. Just the fact that they accompanied the messenger. Otherwise, it was like he was a walking companion. And one year he would go for Hajj, and one year he would go in jihad, fi sabilillah. And he would spend upon the ulama, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala blessed him. His father was a tajir, a merchant. And so he inherited a lot of wealth. And he would spend upon people. And so many beautiful stories are mentioned regarding him actually. One time he was going for Hajj. And he would come to the caravan. And when he met the rest of the people in that caravan, he said that they were his companions in Hajj. So he goes off to Hajj with them. And he says, initially, before when they started, he said, let us gather our wealth in one box that we've brought. And I will take care of managing everything. Because instead of everyone, for example, going and just like an agent does today, for example, he'll book the hotels, he'll take care of the flights and whatnot. Abdullah Mubarak said, let's gather. Of course, the agent takes a lot of money from you in the process. Going to make $300, $500 off each head, right? That's not what Abdullah Mubarak did. He said, listen to the story. He says, gather your wealth, put it into a box, and using that, I will manage, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala, take care of where we're going to stay, all of the food that's going to come, and so on and so forth, the entire journey, the process. All of that, I'll take care of it. So he gathers all this wealth from all of the companions that were coming for Hajj, and he put it into a box. And as a side point, this is actually really beneficial when you're traveling. How do you see barakah in your journey? Not when everyone pays for themselves. That's the greatest method to deprive you of barakah in your journey. What did Abdullah Mubarak rahimahullah ta'ala do? He told everyone, he said, gather your wealth in a box. And I will manage everything. I'll arrange where we're going to stay and the food and all of that. So they go in Hajj. And as they're going for Hajj, whichever country they pass by, for example, in those days you would go to each country because it was a long journey. So you would stop as caravan, entire caravan, for example, coming for Hajj. You go to each country, you'll stop there for a few days, then you'll travel again. It might take you 6 months just to get to, for example, Makkah al-Mukarramah from wherever you're coming from. So he says, I would go for Hajj, or they were in the process of Hajj. And they would stop by in places. And whenever they would go anywhere, they would have a place set up. Abdullah Mubarak had managed everything. Make sure you have a place which is set up for the Hujjaj. They would rest over there. He would bring the best of food for them, the best possible food ever. And they would be welcomed with the best of food. And people would be there to welcome them. And a beautiful experience. And then when he got to Mecca and Medina, he told them, he said, listen, whatever gifts your people back home have told you guys, for example, to purchase for them, I will give you wealth. And I'm going to take it out of the box that we initially gather the money in. Go and use this, and by using this wealth, purchase whatever you got to get, the gifts that you have to get for your people. So they would go, they would purchase those gifts, and they would purchase those gifts, or they purchased those gifts and they took them back home. When they arrived back home after completing the Hajj, as they entered their country, Abdullah Mubarak had actually set a place for them to meet and for people to come to visit them. And then he had decorated each of their homes, the door of each of their homes, because they're Hujjaj coming back from Hajj. This is a great sha'ir of Islam. Remember this, guys. When the Hujjaj come back, go to visit them. Go to visit them. This is one of the greatest symbols of Islam. Hajj is one of the greatest symbols of Islam. And respecting the symbols of Islam is respecting Islam. So they would go and they would visit all these individuals that came for Hajj. And Abdullah Mubarak had it such that all their homes were decorated. And when they got back, he gave each one of them a pouch that had money in it. So they said, what is this? They said, you know the initial wealth that we gathered and we put inside that box initially? I invested it. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala granted us barakah in it. And this is your return. And he gave each of them, he managed the whole thing. And then in the end, he gave each of them back more than what they actually put inside initially, along with giving them all of what they did within the Hajj itself. طبعا يعني he just said that to make it easy for them. Of course, very unlikely he invested in and so much barakah was granted, and more likely that he just spent his own money on all of them. But to make it seem to them, not to make them feel uncomfortable, as if they're taking from the sadaqah of Abdullah Mubarak, he said, I invested your wealth and Allah granted barakah, and subhanAllah, this is your return. And he gave it back to them. So this was the individual he was. The whole reason we're talking about Abdullah Mubarak is that because he would spend upon the ulama of the ummah. He would spend upon the ulama of the ummah. And there were 4 scholars worldwide, and from them was Imam Malik rahimahullah ta'ala. Every single year, he would send a pouch of gold coins to Imam Malik, and he would say, you take this, you will use this, and then all of your expenses, inshallah, you can fulfill using this for the entire year. All you have to do is focus on ilm. All you have to do is focus on ilm. Some of his folks, they came to him, they said, look, there's poor people in our country too. Why do you spend upon these people? He says, when I spend upon the ulama, I'm giving life to this deen. This deen comes into existence. It is granted life by the work of the ulama. Because they're the ones that will go and propagate the religion. They're the ones that are going to go and teach the religion. And so when they're free to teach their religion, they will teach. And when they're worried about other things like expenses and so on, they're not able to teach. So by spending upon, that's why we said, charity, all forms of charity are good. And yes, a person should never spend all his charity in one place. One of the greatest forms of charity, one of the greatest forms of charity is spending upon tullab al-ilm, students of knowledge, and spending upon ulama, so that ulama can serve the religion without the worry that I have expenses that I have to take care of. This is one of the greatest forms of charity. And these ulama are the ones that go and when they serve and they're not worried about anything else, they're able to bring to life entire communities, in fact, entire countries, sometimes the entire world, they're able to affect and influence. That's how much barakah Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grants them. And subhanAllah, Imam Malik rahimahullah ta'ala, he was free. And he was able to spend time with ilm. And today, 1400 years later, we're still benefiting from what? From the ilm of Imam Malik rahimahullah ta'ala as we study the Muwatta. Naam. So Imam Malik rahimahullah ta'ala, so Abdullah Mubarak used to spend upon Tullabul Ilm. We were mentioning that. So charity sometimes, again, this was all from the narration of the messenger where he said that sometimes you, to the brother, you are granted barakah in your wealth because of the talabul ilm of your brother. Through his seeking knowledge, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is granting you barakah. So the barakah is ajib. The dots are connected in different ways. طيب, based on, look at the barakah that he was granted. Based on his obedience of his mother. Ibn Khuzaymah, he says, I heard Bundar say, ما جلست مجلسي هذا حتى حفظت جميع ما خرجته. Or ما خرجته. Or خرجته. Meaning whenever he would hear something, he would memorize it. Allah gave him an exceptional memory. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave him an exceptional memory through, again, this is what barakah is. One person, for example, he disobeys the mother, but then he studies ilm and spends days upon days upon days and he can't memorize anything. Nothing's entering into his mind. Nothing's entering and sinking into his heart. Another person, he obeys his mother. So that timing he didn't spend in talabul ilm. After that, when he seeks it, everything that the other individual, it took him 2, 3, 4 weeks, 1 month, he was able to attain it within 1 day or 2 days. This is what we call barakah. طيب. Now in some nusakh, over here, you have the addition after Muhammad ibn Bashar, yu'na al-abdi. Yu'na al-abdi. And this is nisba ila abdi Qais, which is a qabila from Rabi'a. We mentioned this in Lamiyah Abi Talib. We mentioned that the major qabail Adnaniyya are 2. The qabail Adnaniyya, they divide into 2 major qabail, which are Mudar and Rabi'a. Mudar and Rabi'a, they were brothers. And from them, the rest of the qabail Adnaniyya, these are 2 major branches, and then from them there are a number of different qabail that branch off. From the ones that branch off from Rabi'a is Abdu Qais. So Muhammad ibn Bashar was from the qabila of Abdu Qais. طيب. And this is with the dabt of yu'na. Yu'na. Now who is the one who said it? Yani who is the one who said yu'na al-abdi? Is it the Musannif, yani Imam Tirmidhi himself, or is it one of his students? Both ihtimalat are there, both possibilities are there. That Imam Tirmidhi is the one who said yu'na al-abdi, or one of his students said yu'na al-abdi. And why would they do this? Sometimes there's a name which is mentioned which possibly someone could misunderstand or not recognize. Let's say a teacher, for example. Now, if I, for example, as a teacher, if I heard something from a teacher and I transmit that information that I heard from my teacher, I know exactly who I'm talking about. So when I say Muhammad ibn Abdullah, for example, which is a very common name, I know who I'm talking about. And maybe the students, the immediate students, also know exactly who I'm talking about. But when that gets put down on paper, years later, the ones that read it, do they know who we were talking about? The answer is probably not. Because how many Muhammads are there? How many? In fact, in Bukhari, one of the biggest discussions is the Muhammadun that are mubham. And Imam Bukhari, in many places, says, Haddathana Muhammad, Haddathana Muhammad. Like, who is he referring to? Now, he probably said it. He knew exactly who he was referring to. His students knew exactly who he was referring to. The problem is, now when we look at it, we're like, okay, which one is this? Because he has a number of teachers. Imam Bukhari has a number of teachers whose name is Muhammad. But they're different teachers. So which teacher is he referring to when he says Haddathana Muhammad? Which teacher is he referring to when he says Haddathana Muhammad? That becomes a problem. So sometimes later students, they would add in the book, for example, after the name is mentioned, they would be like Ya'ni Fulan. They would add another nisbah, another title of that individual that would clarify for everyone who is being intended. That is possible. So he says over here, Yu'na al-abdi. Yu'na al-abdi. You can also read this as Na'ni al-abdi. طيب. And if it was Na'ni, then it would be from the Kalam of the Musannif. Otherwise, there's both ihtimal. It could be from the author himself, Tirmidhi, or it could be from someone after him. And Imam Tirmidhi, it's very unlikely that he said Muhammad ibn Bashar, then he says Yu'na al-abdi. واضح? Because he would just say Muhammad ibn Bashar al-abdi. He wouldn't say Yu'na or Ya'ni. That wording, this wording of Ya'ni, adding I.e., like Ya'ni can translate into I.e., meaning what's intended over here is Fulan. The fact that that wording is there tells us most likely it was one of the later students that added this, and not Imam Tirmidhi himself. Because if Imam Tirmidhi was saying it, he wouldn't say Ya'ni over here. Or he wouldn't say Na'ni. He would just say Muhammad Bashar al-Abdi. He would mention the nisbah directly. واضح? طيب. This Rawi is really important. This individual, we mentioned Allah granted him barakah, right? How much barakah? He is one of the 9 narrators that all of the 6 major books, the authors of the 6 major books, narrate from him in their books. There are 9 narrators, all of the 6 major books. So Bukhari, Muslim, Tirmidhi, Abu Dawood, Nasai, and Ibn Majah. These 6 authors. There are only 9 narrators. Each of them have narrated from that narrator in their books. Otherwise, they have many other teachers. But the 9 individuals that are found in each of these books as immediate teachers of these authors, there are 9 individuals, and one of them is Muhammad ibn Bashar. طيب, who are they? We have number 1, Ziyad ibn Yahya al-Hassani Abu al-Khattab. Ziyad ibn Yahya al-Hassani Abu al-Khattab. And you have Abdullah ibn Sa'id al-Ashaj. Number 2, Abdullah ibn Sa'id al-Ashaj. And number 3, Amr ibn Ali al-Fallas Abu Hafs. And number 4, Muhammad ibn al-Ala ibn Kurayb al-Hamdani. Muhammad ibn al-Ala ibn Kurayb al-Hamdani. And number 5, we have Muhammad ibn al-Muthanna. And number 6, Muhammad ibn Bashar. And number 7, Muhammad ibn Ma'mar ibn Rib'i al-Qaysi. And number 8, Nasr ibn Ali al-Jahdami. And number 9, Ya'qub bin Ibrahim al-Dawraqi. These are 9 ruwat, 9 narrators. All of the Kutub Sitta, the Ashab al-Kutub Sitta, the authors of the 6 major books of Hadith that we have, the 2 Sahih Bukhari, Sahih Muslim, and the 4 Sunan, they all narrate from these 9 narrators in their books. And Al-Dhahabi rahimahullah ta'ala, he gathered 10 narrators in 2 lines. He says, Bundar ibn al-Muthanna al-Jahdami Abu Sa'id Amr wa Qaysi wa Hassani يعقوب والعنبر الجوهري هم مشايخ الستة اعرفهم بإحسان. But in these 2 lines, Imam al-Dhahabi rahimahullah ta'ala, he added 2 individuals that are questionable. And number 1, it was 10 as opposed to 9. And 2 of them were questionable that are not from the 9. So from the 9, he only mentions 8. And he adds 2 that are slightly questionable. Now, who are they? Al-Jawhari, when he says, Al-Abbas, who is Al-Ambari. Al-Ambari is Al-Abbas ibn Abd al-Azim. Al-Anbari is Abbas ibn Abdul Azim. Imam Bukhari rahimahullah ta'ala did not actually narrate from him in his Sahih. He only narrated from him ta'liqan. So where he says Al-Anbari, which is the second last one. Bundar ibn al-Muthanna al-Jahdami Abu, these three are from the 9. Abu Sa'id and Amr wa Qaysi wa Hassani, these again are from the 9. Ya'qub wal-Anbari. Wal-Anbari is not from the 9 that we mentioned. And in reality, Al-Anbari, this individual Abbas ibn Abdul Azim, Imam Bukhari only narrated from him ta'liqan. And the second one is Al-Jawhari. Al-Jawhari is Ibrahim ibn Sa'id. Al-Jawhari as well, صريحا or صراحة, Imam Bukhari does not narrate from him in his Sahih. And there are some that mention that Imam Bukhari narrated from him. Ibn Asakir mentioned it, and some people followed him in this regard. But in reality, he does not narrate from him in his Sahih. Al-Jawhari is not supposed to be from them. So from the 9 that we mentioned, Imam al-Dhahabi rahimahullah ta'ala, how much did he put in those 2 lines? 8. And he added 2 more, the last 2, Al-Anbari and Al-Jawhari. In reality, they shouldn't be here. واضح? Al-Anbari, Imam Bukhari narrated from him ta'liqan, and as for Al-Jawhari, Ibrahim ibn Sa'id, Imam Bukhari did not narrate from him to begin with, although some have mentioned it. واضح? And Imam al-Dhahabi did not mention Muhammad ibn al-Ala al-Hamdani. So from the 9, he didn't mention Muhammad ibn al-Ala al-Hamdani. طيب. That's why Shaykh al-Ethiopi, he's also, rahimahullah, he recently passed away, he was in Mecca. He's compiled very large shuruh on some of the great books of hadith. Beneficial shuruh, like he's a jami'. He compiled from all of the previous shuruh together, and he put these shuruh together upon great books of hadith. One of his most extensive sharh is upon An-Nasa'i. So he reworded this to include the 9 that we mentioned. So he says, اشترك الأئمة الهداة ذو الأصول الستة الوعاة في الأخذ عن 9 شيوخ مهرة الحافظين الناقدين البررة أولئك الأشج وابن معمري نصر ويعقوب وعمر السري وابن العلاء وابن بشار كذا ابن المثنى وزياد يحتذى. In these lines, in these 4 lines, he's gathered all 9. So it's better to memorize these 4. Also memorize the ones that Dhahabi mentioned. But you keep in mind that, okay, the last 2, Al-Anbari and Al-Jawhari, are not actually from the 9 that everyone narrates from. Rather, were added by Dhahabi, and they're not correct. And Dhahabi did not mention Muhammad ibn al-Ala al-Hamdani. That should have been mentioned. Okay. Muhammad ibn Bashar, he narrates from Muhammad ibn Ja'far. And who is Muhammad ibn Ja'far? He's Gundar. He's known as Gundar. Muhammad ibn Ja'far al-Hudhali mawlahum. And he's also, like we said, Rawalahu al-Jama'ah. All 6 books of hadith have him mentioned. Now, when we mentioned that these 9, we're not trying to say that there's only 9 ruwat that are found in the 6 books, all 6 books. We're trying to say the authors of these 6 books, their immediate teacher. يعني اشتركوا في 9 رواة مشايخ لهم. Their immediate teachers. In their immediate teachers, there were 9 individuals that all of them narrated from in their books. Not overall. Overall, there are many more than 9. Like every one of them has narrations from Umar radiallahu anhu, correct? Like, so we're not talking about upper or higher up in the chain. We're referring to their immediate teachers. واضح? نعم. So we said regarding Gundar Muhammad Ja'far al-Hudhali, أخرج الأئمة الستة حديثه في صحيحين. But none of them met him because he is a طبق above. And Gundar, who's Muhammad Ja'far, he narrates from Shu'bah ibn al-Hajjaj, and he stayed with him for around 20 years. لازمه نحو من 20 سنة. And Gundar is a very famous muhaddith as well. From him, Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal narrated, and from him, Yahya ibn Ma'in narrated. And Yahya ibn Ma'in said regarding him, كان أصح الناس كتابا. كان أصح الناس كتابا. وأراد بعض الناس أن يخطئ غندرا فلم يقدر. يا سلام. And he had the strongest ضبط. And some people actually tried to make him make a mistake, because that would actually happen sometimes later on in the later part of the 2nd century and beginning part of the 3rd century. Ilm al-Hadith became such that sometimes they would actually try and look for mistakes and see if they would try and catch them, see if the muhaddithun made mistakes. And they would sometimes set them up too. Sometimes they would set them up as well. And a lot of them, they were not pleased with that. They would get angry at that and get annoyed at that. But this was out of their want to make sure that everyone's, and in the end it helped, because it made sure that everyone was very careful as to what they narrated. Naam. So some tried to make Gundar make a mistake, but they were not able to. طيب. الذهبي, he says, ما أظنه رحل في الحديث من البصرة وابن جريج هو الذي سماه غندرا وذلك لأنه تعنت ابن جريج في الأخذ وشغب عليه أهل الحجاز فقال ما أنت إلا غندر وكان يصوم يوما ويفطر يوما منذ 50 سنة. الله أكبر. Number one, Ibn Jurayj is the one who gave him the title of Gundar. And what is Gundar? Gundar is like a young individual that is, they say in the books, Saminun ghalidun na'imun. Saminun ghalidun na'imun. And he had a little bit of weight, possibly. And so he gave him this title. Why? Because Ibn Jurayj was a teacher and he would keep bothering him to take hadith from him. One day he just got annoyed, he's like, yeah, Gundar. But then it stayed with him. And the title stayed with him. Even though it's not that good of a title, it stayed with him. And this happens. A lot of the muhadithun, they have titles, they're given titles, and then it stays with them. Now, alhamdulillah, Gundar is not one of those ones that is very commonly known the meaning of. So because the meaning is not commonly known, not a lot of people are able to recognize what it actually means. So because of that, it doesn't really come off as negative. But there's some titles that were given to some scholars of hadith that everyone knows the meaning of. So it automatically comes off as a negative title. But the moment they become mashhur with it and it runs with it, then they're not able to avoid that title. Like regarding Gundar, in Muhammad ibn Ja'far, they mentioned that he would fast one day and do iftar one day. This is Sawmu Dawood. What is Sawmu Dawood? For you to fast one day and the next day don't fast. Third day fast, fourth day don't fast. He did this for 50 years. For 50 years consecutively, he fasted one day and iftar one day. Naam. Like he narrates from Shubah. And Shubah, he is, we mentioned before many times, Amirul Mu'mineen fil Hadith. One of the greatest scholars of hadith. وهو أبو بسطام. Shouldn't be Ibn Bistam. Abu Bistam. نعم. Ibn al-Hajjaj al-Ataki مولاه بصري الأصل. And he was one of the greatest scholars of hadith. And Athawri used to say regarding him, Amirul Mu'mineen fil Hadith. Amirul Mu'mineen fil Hadith. نعم. And Shafi'i rahimahullah ta'ala, he said, لولا شعبة ما عرف الحديث بالعراق سمع الحسن والثورية وخلقا كثيرا وهو من كبار أتباع التابعين. If it wasn't for Shu'bah, hadith would not be recognized in Iraq. Shu'bah heard from Al-Hasan and Al-Thawri and many great scholars. وهو من كبار أتباع التابعين, is from the greatest of the أتباع التابعين, even though Thawri is معاصر of Shu'bah. نعم. And Hamad ibn Zayd, whenever he would transmit hadith from Shu'bah, he would say, حدثنا الضخم عن الضخام شعبة الخير أبو بسطامي. Now, he narrates from Abu Ishaq. This is Abu Ishaq al-Sabi'i, who is Amr ibn Abdullah ibn Dhi Yuhmid al-Hamdani al-Kufi, who is a tabi'i. Here he's seen Ali radiallahu ta'ala and many other companions, and he's a great tabi'i. And he was born in the Khilaf of Uthman radiallahu ta'ala anhu. And it's mentioned regarding him that he heard hadith from over 38 companions. Now, look at this beautiful incident. Now, normally when you have great individuals, they recognize the virtue and the greatness within each other. That's why the messenger said, or the likes of it is transmitted, I'm not sure of the exact wording, that the Ahlul Fadl, Ahlul Khair, لا يعرف الفضل في أهل الفضل إلا ذووه. That the virtue in the people of virtue is only recognized by the people of virtue. Someone who doesn't understand virtue will never ever be able to see virtue. And he will never recognize virtue. واضح? The virtue in the people of virtue is only recognized by the people of virtue. The individuals who have fadl and virtue, they're able to recognize virtue when they see it in someone else. As for the one who doesn't have it, and he's void of it, he will never see virtue. Because he doesn't know what it is. He doesn't even know what he's looking for. He doesn't know what he's looking for. So how do you validate virtue within individuals? By looking at what the people of virtue say regarding those individuals. And not what the people who lack virtue say regarding those individuals. Na'am. So one time Ash-Sha'bi and Abu Ishaq al-Sabi'i, they gathered. So Ash-Sha'bi said to Abu Ishaq, أنت خير مني يا أبا إسحاق. Abu Ishaq al-Sabi'i, yani Ash-Sha'bi says to Amr ibn Sharahil, Ash-Sha'bi was also a great tabi'i, he said, you are better than me, O Abu Ishaq. So Abu Ishaq replied by saying, لا والله بل أنت خير مني وأسن مني. You are better and you're older than me too. You're older than me as well. Na'am. So, Na'am, Abu Ishaq al-Sabi'i was a great tabi'i. He narrates from Al-Bara ibn Azib radiyallahu ta'ala anhu, who is Abu Imara, Na'am, from the great companions of the Messenger sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wa sallama. And Al-Bara ibn Azib, he narrates the hadith. What is the hadith as we mentioned before? كان رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم رجلا مربوعا بعيد ما بين المنكبين عظيم الجمة إلى شحمة أذني عليه حلة حمراء ما رأيت شيء قط أحسن منه. نعم. رجلا In the riwayat mu'tamada, it's with this dabt, rajulan. What does rajulan literally mean? It means a man, an individual. In some nusakh, it's rajilan. We have two words, rajulan and rajilan. Rajulan means an individual, a man. And rajilan is that individual whose hair is between being extremely curled versus being extremely straight. Rajulan means his hair is wavy. And rajulan means he's just a man. So some said that this is more appropriate. And it should be rajulan and not rajulan. Because what does it mean to say rajulan? And kana Rasul, the messenger was a man. طبعا, of course he was a man. So how would that benefit us to describe him as being an individual, a man? What makes more sense is for you to say the messenger was a person who had wavy hair. That's an actual khabar. As for him being a man, rajul, this is something which is ma'ruf. Okay? It's obvious. And then marbu'an means of medium height. However, and then some also mentioned that this wording, that fulan was a rajul, fulan was a rajul, some of the shurrah mentioned this. This has not been heard regarding anyone else or from anyone else describing the Messenger. Nobody ever said the Messenger was a rajul, a man, like that. It's not been found anywhere. Okay. So some mentioned that most likely over here it was ish. كان رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم رجلا مربوعا. طيب, this same hadith is also narrated in Bukhari and Muslim without the wording رجلا to begin with. It's just كان رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم مربوعا. كان رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم مربوعا. Okay, this is what some muhaqqiqun or some scholars from the shurrah have mentioned. However, Mullah Ali Qari, he, in his sharh, he did ta'aqqub upon this. He said this is not correct. And the idea that this should actually be rajulan and it shouldn't be rajulan because of the reasons that were mentioned, this is not correct. Rather, we should take this in the meaning of rajulan. And when the person says the messenger was a man of medium height, what he's trying to say is that he was a complete individual, an individual that was befitting regarding whom we say he was an actual man. He was an actual man, unlike a lot of men. Okay? So to show that he had reached the perfection of what it means to actually be and embody being a man. This is what it's meaning, what it's intended over here. And then he says, Mullah Ali Qari says, this is very common in language. In Arabic, you find this very commonly. For example, they say, Fulanun rajulun karimun wa rajulun salih. In fact, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, Antum qawmun tajhalun. You are a people that are ignorant. Of course they're people. We know they're people. So why didn't Allah just say Antum tajhalun? Rather, he said Antum qawmun tajhalun. Likewise, he says Antum qawmun musrifun. So this is, Mullah Ali Qari says, this is a common usage in the Arabic language. After researching, we found that the Messenger himself, we find in other hadith, in the hadith of Bukhari, the Messenger himself, when he was describing one time a dream that he had seen, in that dream he said, وَرَأَيْتُ عِيسَى رَجُلًا مَرْبُوعًا مَرْبُوعَ الْخَلْقِ إِلَى الْحُمْرَةِ وَالْبَيَاضِ سَبِطَ الرَّأْسِ. The Messenger himself describing Isa alayhi salatu wasalam, he used the term رَجُلًا مَرْبُوعًا. So this solidifies for us that the correct dabt over here, which is, as we mentioned in the majority of the nusakh, is rajulan and not rajilan. Even though there are some shurrah that said rajulan was better, we say what's better is rajulan and not rajilan. He says marbu'an. Marbu'an is the same meaning of rab'atan. We already mentioned this before. The messenger was of medium height, sallallahu alayhi wasallam. Then he says ba'ida ma bayna al-mankibayn. He had distance between his two shoulders, meaning his chest was broad, sallallahu alayhi wasallam. This is a sign of strength. In some nusakh, it's bu'aid as opposed to ba'id. Bu'aid as opposed to ba'id. And in reality, the musaghar version of this should be bu'ayyid. Right? It shouldn't be bu'aid. But however, this is, in Arabic, you can also do tasghir in this manner. In certain scenarios where they say bu'aid, just like in ghulam, they say ghulaym instead of ghulayim. If you were to accept this, then that would suggest that the distance between the shoulder blades was not very excessive, because ba'id normally means to be very distant, right? It was somewhat distance, meaning it wasn't so excessively distant that it was uncommon and it wasn't something it was looked down upon. But it was distance as opposed to being very close together. So there was i'tidal. There was a degree of balance in the body of the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wa alihi wasallam. And many of them, they say that this version where it says bu'aida with tasghir is actually problematic. And in the sihha is problematic. It should be ba'id and not bu'aid. واضح؟ نعم. Ibn Hajar رحمه الله تعالى, he says وقيل بالتصغير وهو غريب بل في صحته نظر. What is the correct wording? The one that we have written down over here is بعيد ما بين المنكبين. Like بعيد ما بين المنكبين over here, بعيد is مضاف and ما بين المنكبين is مضاف إليه. In some versions it's with رفع, يعني بعيد ما بين المنكبين, يعني بعيد هو ما بين المنكبين, and both work. Then he says عظيم الجمة. With this we'll continue inshallah in the next lesson regarding the hair, the blessed hair of the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam. There's a number of discussions that we're going to have regarding this inshallah ta'ala.